Day 36, Kiev is still held by the Ukrainians. President Zelensky has come out and said that Russia's invasion is at a turning point. But given what's happening on the ground, do you think it is a turning point?
Well, the short answer is no. I think language is key here. Although Kiev, clearly there's an operational pause around Kiev for the fighting, but fighting is continuing in the Donbass region. Which is
over here. Let's just circle that so we know where that is.
And it's very, very determined fighting. And likewise in Mariupol, down to the south. It's pretty obvious that phase one of Russia's plan didn't go entirely according to plan. But I think we must never forget that Russia is a global superpower with 10 times the size of resources. Whilst Zelensky's language may well be there to raise morale of his troops, there's also no doubt that Ukraine is still in a very difficult situation, and we've yet to see phase two of Russia's plan kick in.
Well, talking of phase two, Russia's deputy defence minister has said there's going to be reduced military activity around Kiev and Chernihiv. But we have seen... let me get that. We've seen attacks on Chernihiv, haven't we? So what do they mean by reduced military activity?
Well, first of all, I would be extremely cynical about any Russian statement about their tactics. You do not tell your enemy what you're about to do. One of the most effective ways of prosecuting war is through deception, and history is littered with that. So I think we have to take any statement with a large pinch of salt. But it may be that because of the situation around Kiev, part of this is the Russians making a virtue out of necessity, because the reality is they've got forces that are stalled, and therefore, both sides do not want to see Kiev end up the same way as Mariupol, flattened. So it looks like the Russians' priority is across the Donbass and to the south, and therefore, by liberating troops, by adopting a more defensive posture, you need significantly fewer resources to do defence than you do offence, would allow them to re-brigade their resources. That doesn't mean you stop fighting. You still fire mortars, you still fire rockets, you still fire artillery, because you still want to keep the enemy's head down. It does provide, though, the Ukrainians the opportunity, because now that the forces are static, the Ukrainians can now mount counterattacks. And I think we've been seeing a little bit more of that. The challenge with the Donbass, unfortunately, if you remember the resupply convoy for Kyiv, 40-mile convoy, real problems for Russia. In the Donbass region, they don't have those problems. You're right on the Russian border, so resupplying fuel, people, ammunition would make life a lot easier for the Russians and, of course, also make it a lot more difficult for the Ukrainians.
Now, the head of GCHQ has been speaking in Australia overnight and has said that Putin massively misjudged his own capabilities and that his advisors, because the situation is so dire, they're simply not telling him the truth. Do you think that he did misjudge the capabilities, and do you think those people are not telling Putin what the real story is on the ground?
Well, I think there can be little doubt that Putin's initial ambition of just walking in and being welcomed over 48 hours was folly. So there's no doubt that they didn't game this properly. In the West, when we're doing any of these sorts of scales of operations, there's an intense planning period. For the invasion of Iraq, you get military leadership, they train, they practice, they look at courses of action, what's the most dangerous, what's the most likely, and then you have a very animated conversation between the senior leadership and the political masters to make sure everybody understands the risks involved. And then you do lots of training to make sure your troops are ready. It's pretty evident none of the troops were ready for this, the logistics supply wasn't ready for this, and they didn't really have a plan B. So for Putin, who speaks truth to power? How does Putin engage with that process rather than just having a bunch of yes men charging around? In the West, as Churchill famously described democracy as the least worst option, but we do have the press, we have the people, we have the military and the politicians all engaged in a very animated conversation so that when people go across and start a campaign, they're ready and they understand what happens when the plan doesn't survive contact. It's pretty evident that's not the case. I think the irony of all of this, of course, is that Putin, the one thing he was seeking to avoid is what's coming to him. He was seeking to avoid Ukrainian resurgence of their nationalism. Also, NATO is much stronger and more coherent, and likewise the impact long-term on his economy. Not what he would have expected.